Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for me. Um, I've got a lot of fairly complicated ground to cover, I guess. I'm going to try and keep it focused on the sort of things you folk might find interesting. But if I sort of get too technical or too detailed, please feel free to stop me. Also, I think, David, I've got 40 minutes. I'll try and get through the meat of this and then just have plenty of time for questions. But I don't mind if someone wants to interject and ask a question along the way. Having said that, I'm going to have to provide a little bit of context so you understand broadly what it is that our project's about. And then I'll try to spend most of my time talking about both the CX standards and guidelines we create, and in particular, the process we use to create them. So as I said, I'm Barry Thomas. I'm the General Manager of the Data Standards Body for the Australian Consumer Right. You have the next slide, please. So I've just got a bit of a blurb there on what the Consumer Data Right is. It's an intent from the Australian government to make people's data available to them. And by people's data, I mean the stuff held by at the moment, certainly larger entities. So we started with banking. We're in progress standardizing the energy sector. We know we're going to do for the sector after that. But the intent is for this to be an economy-wide thing, which gives consumers the ability to go to their provider and say, I want to share my data. I want to pass it to another entity to achieve some kind of an end. And that end might be getting a better product, determining or help learning how to manage their money better. I've just put on battery-backed solar at my house. It would have been very useful to, we're not ready yet, but if the regime had allowed, it's been great to be able to grab data from my energy provider and my bank to feed into the provider that gave me the battery and solar panels. And potentially they could have said, okay, you're a good credit risk and we will give you this package and you'll pay nothing because we know you're going to make enough money back from your feed-in tariffs to be able to cover the loan and so on. Or that could be done automatically. But there's the realm of things you could do are limited only by imagination. And I think that's part of the goal, is to enable a lot of innovation and feed a whole new, initially a fintech industry, but it goes well beyond fintech to a whole world of new ways of using data for consumer benefits. I think the critical thing about it, though, is it's a consumer data right. It's very, very focused on being consumer driven and being done, it's absolutely essentially important, is done at all steps of the way with the consent of the consumer. And that consent can always be withdrawn. So it's essential that, say, if I as a consumer want to take my say my home loan data and share it with another provider to determine whether or not there's a better home loan out there I might want to apply for, I am able to be very specific. I can say to my bank, share this data and it can only be used for this purpose for this length of time. And if at any point I don't like what's happening, I feel I change my mind, I can rescind that consent, and that immediately flows down through all the parties that the data has been shared with. The data must be deleted at that point. So that makes the consumer data right as a project a complicated set of overlapping problems. Partly it's about figuring out how to share data across all these entities, but equally it's about making sure that people can understand what their rights are at every step of the way and understand how to consent and what consent would mean. Go to the next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on this screen, but again, it's just for context. To create the consumer data right, basically the Australian government has put an obligation on what we call data holders. At the moment, data holders mostly means banks. That requires them to expose this data, to respond to a request, an appropriately authenticated request with the data that's been asked for. In principle. That could be done without standards. Every bank could do it their own way, but of course that would be hugely inefficient. It would also pose security risks, because while our big banks are very secure, we have a very long tail of small banks who are less resourced. It's in everyone's interest for there to be a standard, particularly around security. And again, it's consistency for consumers. That consumer experience, which is central, standardizing that is what makes it possible for people to understand what they're doing. If the consumer experience differed across all the data holders, it can become very confusing, very difficult to understand what you've agreed to. So the data standard role in this is to set those standards. And as you can imagine, that's there's a lot of stakeholders. Even if we just restrict ourselves to the banking sector, our first sector of the economy, in Australia, we're talking about maybe 90 banks. The four major ones represent 80% of accounts. We've got a very, very long tail, all of whom are facing the same obligation. And the intent is there will be hundreds, thousands of third parties, data recipients that will take the data and provide useful services. There's a very, very large community of parties that may want to work with this data. And of course, there's regulators, there's privacy advocates, there's consumer groups, there's the consumers themselves. The world of people that are going to have an opinion about how this works or should work is absolutely immense. It's mind-bogglingly huge. And often they have a lot of very specialist information about what can and can't work. That with the best will in the world, the most well-resourced, most well-staffed set of regulators and standards body, we can't keep up with all those issues. So a lot of our role is in trying to get everyone together and pick their brains and get clear on what are the issues we need to address. We try to address those across the information security bit. There's what we refer to as endpoints, which are basically, you can think of them as the drive-up windows of the data holder, where you can go to get, say, your transaction account data or your mortgage data or your scheduled payments or whatever. There's a whole lot of definition work that goes into figuring out what a payload looks like. So it's an interesting thing, but until you really think about it, you don't realize that there is no definition for what a banking product is. So being able to describe in a consistent manner all the different products that banks offer is in itself an enormous challenge. So figuring out what all of the data payloads looks like is a lengthy process. And all of this is overlaid by this CX question, which interestingly, when we set out on this project, we didn't really allow for it. We set up a structure to create the rules and regulations and standards for the consumer data right, and only then figured out that CX was really important and that we needed to have a team looking at it. It's almost accidental that CX sits within the data standards body within my team. Some of it makes obvious sense. Creating the CX standards themselves sort of fits within our remit. But the role is much broader than that, because you actually need to go out and do CX research right at the beginning, just figuring out what's possible and how people might interact with it. It's the first step before you can start figuring out what the rule of the regime should be. So a concrete example we're dealing with at the moment is something we did research on a couple of years ago, but it's now that we're actually live with the system, it's become very clear to us that we've got a practical problem in this, well, it seemed esoteric, the concept of joint accounts, which of course apply for most mortgages are joint accounts. So that's very important to us to get it right. But there's a difficult question of whether you set something up so that, do you assume that all joint account holders at the outset agree to share their data, or do you assume that they don't agree to share their data, opt out or opt in? And it turns out there's a lot of really difficult argument. It's finely balanced, and you have to do a lot of research, but in particular, you need to do a lot of work to help people, to help guide the community through understanding what all the different issues are. So you have a world of difference between, say, the privacy advocates who want a very locked down regime, and then you've got a lot of the fintechs who are trying to make commercial products out of this. And they want a very low friction process for consent. They want things through very smoothly, very easily. They feel that one party in a joint account goes to share their data to try and get a better home loan, and then they're blocked because the system tells them, hang on, the other person hasn't consented yet, then they'll have a lot of drop-off, and that suggests that happens. But how to balance that against the privacy considerations of assuming consent? So all of that is made a lot easier to talk about. It's not always easy to come to a resolution, but it's a lot easier to talk about if you've got concrete examples. So coming up with wireframes and straw men saying this is how it might work, depending on different rule settings, this is how it might work in practice. That's absolutely critical to getting to a point where people can provide informed feedback. You're never going to have a lack of feedback. Everyone's got an opinion, but informed feedback is what you really want. And that really comes down to being able to give people concrete examples of how things might work. So that, I guess, is the major point that I want to make in this talk, is that the way that we do this has been central to our relative success to date. And the core thing that the data standards body has done from the beginning, which I think is it's the special sauce, is we do everything completely and rigorously in public. There is nothing that happens in the data standards body that is in a back room or to a committee that's invisible to the public. We have a consultation process where we've built a lot of it around a tool called GitHub, which those who have experience with software development would be familiar with. The core principle, though, with GitHub is just that it's a public place where we put up proposals for change, and we let everyone talk. And when parties come to us, as they do all the time, wanting to try and convince us that we should change something or do something differently, if we think they've got anything useful to add, actually, even if we don't think they've got anything useful to add, we still say, okay, that's great, but until it's on GitHub, it didn't happen. We literally will not consider anyone's submission unless it's public, so that everyone gets a chance to comment on it, critique it, provide alternative suggestions. So we have a very highly structured process, which enables literally anyone to make change requests. My grandma could log on and make a change request. We don't have any constraints on who does that. There's no, you don't have to sign up. You don't have to join anything. You can just log on and make a change request, and we consider it along with all the others. The process of dealing with change requests, of creating a backlog, figuring out what we should do and what priority, that also is done publicly. It's done in public meetings. So we collectively come to conclusions about what should be worked on. That can take a while. We get it down to documents we call decision proposals, which are then, again, they're put up for everyone to critique. When we get to the point where we're pretty happy with it all, we have an independent chair who actually makes the standards, who determines that a standard is now binding. The important thing to understand about our independent chair is he effectively functions not as a standard setter, but more as a kind of umpire or referee. And because everything's done in public, because he actually has a statutory requirement to consult and consult widely, he can only make standards once there's an extensive trail of, I guess, evidence saying this is how we got to the conclusion that this is the right way to go. And we've had so many occasions where parties have raised objections about decisions. And we've been able to, it's effectively just say, let's go to the videotape. We go back to GitHub, we go back to the consultation process because it's all documented, and say, all right, well, here is why we've come to this point. You may not agree with the decision that's been made, but it's available for everyone to see why we got there and what evidence was considered along the way. A concrete example of that right now is we've got some of the major banks raising concerns about some of the information security standards, and those are valid concerns, but we've also been able to point out to them that the InfoSec profile as it stands today is largely the way it is because those very same banks insisted on it 2 years ago. So that short circuits some very difficult conversations. It's very useful to us. Next screen, please. So I probably won't spend much time on this other than to say this is kind of trying to describe what I'm sure can look like a complicated process, but for those, we have a very engaged community, and everyone has come over time to expect plenty of opportunity to contribute. But again, it's a rigorous process that we say we're going to do it, and people can then, and they have, pull us up if we don't follow it correctly. There has been one concrete example where we made a standard and someone in the community said, hang on, you haven't properly followed your process here. We pulled the standard, we reverted it. It had substantial costs and problems that we did that. But we had to follow, the process was essential. If we didn't follow the process, we don't have anything. So we're very, very rigorous about that. Next screen, please. So this is just a quick visual to give you an idea of our outputs. So the top left one is, and don't strain your eyes looking at it, but there'll be links at the slide at the end of this where you can go and check these things out for real. It's all this stuff again, public. Top left though is the standards, the technical standards, or it's the website which provides technical standards. Again, it's all there, it's all versioned. Everyone can see what the current standards are, what they've been through the last, I don't know, 30 odd iterations we've been through in the last 3 years. Very eagle-eyed people might see in the very, very bottom left, there's a link at the bottom of the screen to the draft energy standards. So as I said, we're moving into doing the energy sector. So the energy standards will be folded back into this site once energy goes live, once the energy standards are finally determined. But at the moment, again, energy standards are being developed in public. Similarly, the next version of this, I think this is version 1.9, version 1.10, which will be the next version, is available on a staging server so everyone can go and see the proposed changes in context. So that's our technical standards. The screen on the right is a shot out of our CX standards. And I guess the key thing to look at there is, well, firstly, it's both text and it's wireframes, it's visuals. So people can see how this, and sorry, the standard assumption here is that most of the CX applies to phones, mobile apps. The normal way to interact with this will be via mobile apps. So most of our wireframes are on that basis. But you'll notice on the right, there's both rules, which are mandatory. So these are things about the way you present the data that you have to comply with. But we also have guidelines. So we have actually many more guidelines than we have rules. We're trying to leave as much as possible in what we refer to as a competitive space, leave room for innovation, while locking down the things which have to be locked down. There's a problem with creating a honeypot of data like this, is there's lots of temptation for bad actors or even not particularly good actors to try and rig the system a bit so that people tend to give up more data than they should. So being very, very strict about some things is essential. And a particularly key example, of course, being the requirement that people understand that at all times they can withdraw their consent. Next screen, please. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is GitHub, and you can see there that we've got this is current from today. There's a set of decision proposed, and there's other things, noting papers and so on in there as well. Follow the link at the end, you'll be able to see for all these. You can click in, you can see the discussion, some kind of source document, and for some of them, like the one on joint accounts, down towards the bottom, there's a very active conversation going on about that right now, across everything from our major banks down to the Financial Rights Legal Centre and other consumer advocates, and yeah, it's a very robust discussion, all out in the open. Next screen, please. All right, I know no one can see all the details of this, but again, this is illustrative of how we tend to work. It's interesting that a large chunk of our work has happened since the pandemic started. And we had to lock down and no one, when I first started in this job, I was on a plane every day going to another city. There are lots and lots of meetings to go to all over the place, very, very time consuming. And initially, once we locked down, we thought, and certainly the banks thought, that the project was going to have to be delayed. And it turns out that we didn't need to at all. Working online has been an absolute godsend. It's made us vastly more efficient. And a key to this is we use a tool called Miro, which is an example of a board on Miro. We've just created a whole lot of assets. When you're using this, you can zoom in to different parts. And in fact, as a presenter, you can guide everyone. You can grab, in effect, you kind of grab their cursor and drag them all to a point on the screen and say, look at this. But we create these visual assets and we run people through workshops. We've had 150 people on a workshop at a time. We talk them through issues. We discuss the things we want to cover off, like how a particular workflow should happen, like what are the appropriate things to surface at different points in a flow. And then we will typically break everyone up into groups. We'll have facilitators for each group. Each group might have 10 people in it, and they will take a part of the board and they'll go in and look in detail, and they discuss things. They put post-it notes and comments on their parts of the flow. So everyone can talk about that for an hour or two, and they come back to the group, and then the group, everyone presents back their collective findings. At the end of the day, what we've got is a board covered in sticky notes and comments. It's recorded as well. They're incredibly rich sources of a very diverse range of opinions about how particular things can work. So the art form here is just figuring out what to discuss and making sure you've done your homework, so you've got a positive experience for people that they can really engage with and provide useful feedback on. But we found this incredibly useful, efficient way of getting lots of information out of a very large number of people across complex issues in a way that's digestible, that we can feed into the standards process. But again, and this is essential, all of this stuff remains publicly available. So we can always go back and say, so why do we make this decision, or who raised this issue at what point? We can always go back and find out, okay, well, we know it was someone from National Australia Bank raised this point about this point in the flow at this workshop. So it's a process which everyone's adapted to remarkably well. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the outputs, our CX standards, this is a bit more of a look at how they appear to the users. So I touched on the importance of consent in our process, and a lot of our CX work is around consent, around the process of how someone says, I want to share this data, and then how they are authenticated by the data holder to make sure that the request to share the data is valid. And then they can, once they've been authenticated, they can authorize the sharing of the data. It can be a complicated process. We try to make it as smooth as we possibly can and put a lot of work over a long time into trying to make it as, to make sure the friction is in the right places. So there's friction in the places where we want people to stop and think, do I really want to do this? Because the thing about what we're creating here is a model for people to share their data, which, as I said, economy-wide. You can easily imagine a situation in the not too distant future where people may have been consenting to specific uses of different sets of their data across lots of different sectors. They could be sharing their banking data, their energy data, their telco data, potentially be looking at applying the same regime to the social media companies, anything you can imagine. And so as an individual, it may be quite difficult to be clear about what you've consented to over what time and for what purposes. And again, because there's time constraints of consent, you might set a consent up to be to expire in 24 hours, or you might, if you got it wrong, you might leave it there for a year. So making sure that the interface is as clear as possible and people understand what's happening. I'm not saying we've got it right yet, but it's core to what we're doing, trying to figure all that out. So so this screen is just like it's almost like an overview, an introduction into, okay, here's the key thing we're doing. The next slide, please. And we go a little bit more deeper, explaining a bit more of the issues we're trying to standardize. Next slide, please. And then we get into wireframes. So things we're saying, okay, here's a specific thing that you need to do. And again, a lot of the wireframes are in the guidelines rather than the standards. They're saying, here is a recommendation. You don't have to follow it, but a lot of, particularly the smaller players, will tend to follow it just because they can have a high degree of confidence if they follow the wireframes that they are being compliant. They're not going to get pinged by a regulator for doing something wrong. So the guidelines, without being mandatory, are still hugely persuasive. And next slide, please. And a little more detail again, it's back to that slide I talked about before, where we've got this distinction between rules. And you'll note here that the rules have a reference back. So we have the rules that govern the consumer data right are a legislative instrument. So they, yes, you can be fined for non-compliance. We have our Australian Competition and Consumer Commission is the regulator across this regime. A data holder that fails to make the data available can get pinged for doing that, taken to court. Similarly, the data recipients are accredited by the ACCC, and their accreditation can be revoked for not complying with these rules. So being able to follow them back to the legal document is an important step. And it constrains what the DSB, the Data Standards Body, does as well. When we create our standards, the standards by definition have to fit within the rules. So it's like I said, the governance structure of this is quite important too. We have a structure which balances out the need for government oversight. So we're putting a whole lot of, often very expensive obligations on a lot of parties. So that needs to be rigorously controlled at the highest level. But then there's a lot of practical issues about how things are done, which can't be handled legislatively. It's just too slow, too clumsy. And that's most appropriately dealt with in standards, and then a lower level again in guidelines. Next slide, please. And here's all our links. A lot of those are a bit technical, but I'm hoping at least some of you will find it interesting to go and have a bit more of a dig around all the stuff we've created. It's been a very interesting journey over a number of years, figuring out how to do this. And again, not saying we've got it all right. But when I was first involved in this project, almost exactly 3 years ago, when I first became aware of what was planned, my immediate reaction was there's not a chance in hell it's going to work. The amount of consensus that needs to be built, the number of sheer fine-grained standards that need to exist to enable this to function it would take forever to create. The reality is we have a functioning CDR. It's still in its early stages, but it's working today, and we've got a really strong foundation to really build that across the economy. So that's been a revelation for me. And again, I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that we do it all out in the open. Everyone can critique us. Everyone does critique us, and we're very committed to taking on those critiques. And where there is a way to improve how we work, we adopt it, and everyone can see that we've adopted it.